So the first step of Kant's argument is to talk about the good will. He wants to argue that the good will is the only thing that could be good unconditionally or without limitation. The German can be translated two different ways. Without limitation is more literal. Unconditional is probably better. All right. So Kant asks, we need something, we're going to make an ethical theory. We need something that defines the goodness of everything else. It needs to be good without limitation, unconditionally good. This means it's good in all possible circumstances, good in any case you can imagine. If it's unconditionally good, you cannot even imagine a case or scenario where it isn't good. Now that means if you can imagine a scenario, a case, or a way that X might be bad, then X cannot be unconditionally good. So Kant starts with some candidates for unconditional goodness, and he works through these and he says, well, I'll give you a case or a scenario where these might be bad so we can eliminate them. These can't be what is unconditionally good. All right. So, some candidates Kant considers. Mental talents, like intelligence, creativity. Kant talks about intelligence. I don't think he talks about creativity, but he would definitely put this under this, right? Gifts of fortune, that just means ways you might be lucky, right? Being rich, for instance, is a big one. And then happiness. Happiness, we might argue a bit about what happiness means. Aristotle certainly will when we get to him. For Kant, happiness just means what it does for the utilitarians, pleasure in the absence of pain. But the fact this is listed here, the fact that Kant's going to reject it, should tell you there's going to be a huge difference between Kant and the utilitarian, right? The utilitarian thinks happiness is always good. Kant says, no, it's not. I'll give you circumstances. I'll give you cases where it isn't. The utilitarian, in Kant's language, would say happiness is unconditionally good. Kant will say, no, it isn't, and here's why. All right, so let's start with mental talents. Talents like intelligence, which Kant mentions, charisma, which I don't think he does, and creativity, which he also doesn't. But I think these would also go under mental talents. Now, why are mental talents not unconditionally good? How might they be bad? How and in what circumstances could a mental talent like intelligence, creativity, or charisma be bad? Well, look. If the person who has these traits, intelligence, charisma, creativity, if the person who has them is bad, if he has bad immoral ends, they just make him more able to accomplish those bad ends, right? If you are a dishonest businessman and you want to defraud your customers, well, being intelligent helps you think of new ways to do that, as does being creative, right? Intelligence, creativity, you can think of all kinds of ways to take advantage of and defraud your customers. You're charismatic. You can think of all sorts of ways to charm them when they start asking questions about what you're doing. Right? Plenty of other ways you can think of a person who's a bad person can misuse these things, right? So these can't be unconditionally good, right? You would wish that the dishonest businessman didn't have any of these, right? It's worse if he's smart, creative, and charming, right? If he were dumb, completely unable to think of anything new, and just not at all charming, it would be much harder, maybe impossible for him to defraud his clients. It is bad, it is not unconditionally good that he has these things. In this case, they are not good. They cannot be unconditionally good then. You can think of other cases, but this is just one. Now consider traits, and Kant doesn't call them this, but you might call them virtues, right? Aristotle, who we will talk about in a few weeks, certainly would. And these traits are traits like self-control. You know, you don't lose control, you're able to control yourself. Moderation in emotions, people don't fly off the handle, you know. Calm deliberation, you can sit down and calmly see what you should do. What end is the best one here? Courage. You're brave, you can face danger, you know, you don't panic, you don't run away. Well, again, these have the same problem, Kant will say. Aristotle will have a response to this. It'll be interesting to see what he says. But Kant says these have exactly the same problem as mental talents. And that problem is, if the person who has them is a bad person, it makes him more able to accomplish his bad ends, right? Let's think about courage, right? You know, if someone is a Nazi, you know, do you want him to have courage or not, right? Of course not, right? The Nazi who's a coward is sitting in mom's basement typing, vile little messages on message boards. The more courageous Nazi is marching through the streets of Charlottesville with a tiki torch, hurting people, messing stuff up, right? If someone has a bad will, if he's a bad person, if he has bad ends, he's a Nazi, courage makes him much more able to accomplish those bad ends, makes him more dangerous. If someone is a Nazi, we would want him to be a coward where he's going to hide in mom's basement and not do any damage, right? The same goes for these other virtues: self-control, moderation in emotions, calm deliberation. Look, someone who is an awful person, if he has self-control, if he loses it and shows that he is an awful person, that makes him less dangerous than somebody who can hide the fact, right? Again, think of Nazis, the ones who lose their temper and go into a sputtering rage and say vile stuff are not as dangerous as the Nazis like guys like Richard Spencer, who are able to control themselves and lie and not say what they really think, who won't get rattled, who won't get angry when people press them, right? If someone has awful ends, all of these virtues just make him more dangerous, more able to accomplish his bad ends. These are not good unconditionally, because when the person who has them is bad, they are not good. Now we get to gifts of fortune: power, riches, honor, happiness, things like that. Well, how are they not unconditionally good? Well, again, they just make it easier for bad people to accomplish their bad ends, right? If you are rich and famous and an evil person, you can get away with being an evil person a lot more easily than somebody who's neither rich nor famous, right? How did R. Kelly get away with the stuff he got away with for so long? Well, he was rich, he was famous, right? It made him a much more dangerous person, able to do these things and get away with it because of these traits, right? Because of these gifts of fortune, not traits, but gifts of fortune, power, and riches. I mean, I guess maybe not so much honor as fame, but they're closely related things, right? Again, they make it easier for the person to accomplish their bad ends. That's one reason these can't be unconditionally good. Now, but there's an even deeper reason here, right? And this is actually important because it's a huge difference with the utilitarian, and it's actually an interesting argument against utilitarianism. The even deeper issue here is that Kant thinks it's just not good for someone to have them if they don't deserve them. The biggest of these is happiness. And Kant will say happiness is only good if the person deserves to be happy. Now, why does Kant say this? Well, Kant says this because I think he thinks we all believe it deep down, right? He's saying, I'm making explicit what you already think, what you're committed to. And I think there is something to this, right? I'll give you guys an example. Josef Mengele, Nazi scientist, horrible person, did just awful experiments on concentration camp inmates, and he got away, right? Josef Mengele got away, and he lived, I forget where, I think it was Argentina. A lot of former Nazis went there. Mengele went to Argentina, I'm pretty sure, lived out his days running a farm, right? And Kant would say, look, if you know what Josef Mengele did, it's not good that he is on his farm being relatively happy running a farm, right? Mengele does not deserve to be happy. It is not good, given what Mengele has done, that he's happy. Another example, Idi Amin, dictator of Uganda, also just a terrible person. Amin murdered his political rivals, tortured them, just textbook example of an evil dictator. Started a war with a neighboring country for no good reason, which he lost. But Amin actually escapes. Saudi Arabia gives him, they let him in, and he spends the rest of his days pretty happy. There's pictures of Idi Amin, this monster, basically grinning, happy, sitting by a swimming pool, right? And Kant would say, look, it is not good that Idi Amin is happy. If you know what he's done, if you know that he's tortured and murdered innocent people, that he started a war for no good reason where people died, if you know this about him, you don't look at Idi Amin like sitting by the pool, smiling, or taking a little nice leisurely morning swim. You don't look at that and think, oh, isn't that nice? Edi's happy, right? No, you think this is bad. This person does not deserve to be happy. His happiness is not good. Neither is Josef Mengele's. They don't deserve it. They deserve something else, right? One more thing I'll say about this, this philosopher, philosophers often use outlandish examples, but, I like this one. If you found out that some horrible Nazi war criminal was living in a tropical paradise by a beach, but you could make it rain and make the weather terrible for him every day just by pressing a button, you'd press the button, right? This person doesn't deserve to be happy. He doesn't deserve nice weather. Kant would say not only is it bad if he's happy, Kant thinks it's good if he's unhappy because that's this terrible person getting what he deserves. Now this makes Kant interestingly different from the utilitarian, right? The utilitarian will say happiness is always good no matter whose happiness it is. Now look, the happiness of a bad person might be outweighed by the unhappiness he creates. You know, when in World War II, when France surrendered, there's a picture of like Hitler dancing a little jig because he's so happy. You know, the unhappiness that the Nazis capturing France is going to create, and all the horrible things they're going to do there is outweighed by Hitler's happiness. But the utilitarian would still say, well, that counts in there, right? Hitler's happiness goes in the plus column. It just so happens that all the stuff in the minus column outweighs it. And again, the happiness of a bad person might be outweighed by all the unhappiness the rest of us feel at this person being happy. I'm outraged. I don't like it that Idi Amin's happy. Millions of people probably don't like it. The same with Mengele. That might outweigh the happiness they feel. But again, Amin or Mengele's happiness counts for the utilitarian. It goes in the plus column, even if other stuff in the minus column might outweigh it. It still gets counted. Kant, on the other hand, will say the happiness of an undeserving person is in no way good. In fact, Kant will say the happiness of a person who does not deserve to be happy is in fact a positively bad thing. You utilitarians are wrong. Not only should this not get counted in the plus column at all, it in itself is a negative thing. It goes in there with a minus. Now, keep this all in mind. When we, in a little bit, talk about Kant and the utilitarians on criminal punishment, this will be hugely important. We will come back to this. All right, but we'll leave this aside for the time being. And for the time being, I just want to finish by asking, in all these cases, mental talents, gifts of fortune, traits of character, happiness, what would be the condition of them being good? When would they be good? Well, Kant will say they would be good if the person had a good will, right? If the person has a good will, they will use their intelligence for good ends, or at the very least, they'll never use it for bad ends, right? Usually they'll use it for good ends, but, maybe they won't be out there doing good every second of the day, but they will never misuse their intelligence for a bad end, to hurt, defraud people, something like that, right? When is courage good? When the person has a good will, right? The person has a good will, courage makes him more able to stand up for what is right, to do good things. Same with wealth, other, gifts of fortune, as Kant calls them. And the same goes with happiness, right? If you have a good will, if you are a good person, Kant will say you deserve to be happy. And if you deserve to be happy, then your happiness is a good thing, right? If we hear about somebody who spent their whole life helping others, who is a moral model, and we find out that they were happy, we think, okay, that's good, right? It's good that this good person is happy. They deserve it. So, in all these cases, having a good will is the condition for these things being good. So in his argument, not only does Kant eliminate the other candidates, he says, well, when we think about what would make these things good, what is the condition on them being good, the good will, that's a powerful bit of evidence that the good will is our thing that is unconditionally good in all cases. Well, so how is Kant's argument by elimination for the goodwill being unconditionally good? I think this step of Kant's argument is actually pretty strong. Happiness and virtue are two huge candidates for unconditionally good in the history of ethics. The utilitarian says happiness. Aristotle will say virtue. He'll also, in a way, say happiness, but his definition of happiness is so different than the utilitarian or Kant's that that's a little misleading. But we'll talk about that, right? But, you have these major other strands of ethics. Utilitarianism, well, they say happiness. Virtue theory, they say virtue. Kant considers and he thinks eliminates these things. And he gives good reasons for eliminating both, right? So I think this type of Kant's argument is pretty good. Maybe not perfect, but pretty good. All right. We still aren't at the end. There's a lot further to go. Now we have, well, the goodwill is unconditionally good. That just brings up our next question, though. What in the world is a goodwill? What defines the goodwill? How do we pick out good wills from bad wills, right? That's what we'll look at in the next lecture.